Well, to create some uncertainty in the actions of the Russian armed forces. And what happens at the front, they kind of leave it out of the equation. But the guys are getting shelled there every day. Every single day, they're getting shelled here and there.
And Russia is winning on all fronts, but the huge stream of Ukrainian drones attacking Russia simply overshadows the successes of Russian soldiers at the front. The Russian army is shelling Ukraine on a daily basis and advancing along the entire front line. However, Kyiv is sending many drones to the Russian Federation to destabilize the situation in the country. These are not phrases I made up. This is exactly what Vladimir Putin said today, in plain language. After several days, he finally responded to the massive drone attacks by Ukraine on Russian territory and the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea. Today, Vladimir Putin did his best to convince Russians that there is actually no fuel crisis in Russia. That there is not a single section at the front where Russians are not advancing, and the massive drone attacks are just an attempt to intimidate Russians, nothing more. And then suddenly Vladimir Putin changed his stance and stated that Russia is ready to resume direct negotiations with Ukraine as soon as possible. And Russian war correspondents suddenly started howling that the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing a landing operation in Crimea. And interestingly, today the FSB stated that yes, Vladimir Putin will have to meet personally with Volodymyr Zelensky, because even though in their opinion he is a terrorist, there is no other president of Ukraine. As you can see, the question of the legitimacy of the Ukrainian president is already being pushed far into the background. At the same time, the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, complained today that Russia no longer has any hope that Donald Trump will somehow help them. And he immediately added that in Anchorage, Alaska, in August of last year, Donald Trump simply tricked, deceived, and cheated Vladimir Putin. After all, he promised him the capitulation of Ukraine, which never happened. And now there is information that at the G7 summit, Donald Trump, on the contrary, urged Volodymyr Zelensky to attack Russia more boldly and more forcefully. Because otherwise it won't be possible to force Vladimir Putin to sit down at the negotiating table, and I'll spoil it right away. Vladimir Putin once again humiliated his own propagandists. Do you remember how it was in April and May? The Foreign Intelligence Service, Shoigu, and Russian propagandists were saying that Ukraine was supposedly launching drones at St. Petersburg from the territory of the Baltic countries. So, Vladimir Putin said today that this actually never happened at all. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss all these topics together in detail now. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and write any comment you want.
We all know and see that the Kyiv regime, as the situation at the front rapidly worsens for them, as the enemy loses one territory after another, and our fighters take one settlement after another, they have adopted the tactic of striking our civilian targets, our civilian infrastructure, trying to create problems with the supply of energy resources, to influence the tourist season, which, to be honest, we are being told directly through various channels.
So the Russian leader Vladimir Putin was trying hard today to present the current situation as a victory for the Muscovites. Vladimir Putin complained that behind the massive wall of drone attacks from Ukraine, Russians somehow forget to be proud of their victories on the front. As Vladimir Putin himself stated, the Russian army keeps striking Ukraine daily and is advancing along the entire front line, but Kyiv keeps sending attacks into Russia, a multitude of drones to destabilize the situation in the country. Next, I will quote Vladimir Putin.
Well, and now they clearly, those who came from the front, know our guys are really pressing them hard all along the line of contact, everywhere. There isn't a single place where it's the other way around. No, so these drones, the strikes on civilian infrastructure, what for? Well, to destabilize society. Of course, with such massive pressure, when the entire West is working for them, these drones are coming in a huge stream. To create some kind of doubts about the actions of the Russian armed forces.
And as for what's happening at the front, they sort of leave it out of the picture. But our guys are pounding them there every day, every single day. They're getting hit here and there, and we'll get where we need to go. And you know, if you're 100% sure about what you're saying, then you won't keep repeating the same thing over and over.
Repeat it several times, right? So, Vladimir Putin, after a couple of minutes, repeats again, quote, But our guys are pounding them there every day. Every single day, we'll get where we need to go. The armed forces of the Russian Federation have almost taken the city of Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region, but there are still some people hiding, taking cover, and shooting back in the basements. Well, you know what was forgotten? It's funny. In Vladimir Putin's entire speech today, there was not a single mention of the recent record attack on Moscow, in which the oil refinery in Kapotnya was hit. And in the Moscow region, there was what they call an oil rain. Vladimir Putin decided not to mention this situation at all, as if it never happened. He simply repeated for the third time that Russians should be happy about the advances at the front, because our guys are hitting them every day, and not fill their heads with talk of Ukrainian drone attacks. Meanwhile, Ukraine is increasing its missile and drone strikes on Russia, and just recently several Ukrainian missiles hit a factory in Voronezh that produces electronics for rockets. As a result of the attack, it is reported that at least 5 people were killed and dozens more were injured because they were working in the main building of the factory, which, I emphasize, produces components for missiles that are then launched at Ukrainian civilian cities. And there's no need to say that the employees of this factory didn't know what these missiles were being produced for. They knew perfectly well. I'm more than sure that most of them, if not all, supported this, and they were even proud that they had a hand in making these missiles that were launched at Ukrainians, first in Kiev. They were there and they were involved. The main building of this factory has been completely destroyed. Before that, according to the report from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation dated June 18, Russian air defense systems destroyed a record 992 fixed-wing drones launched at Russia in a single day, the highest number for the entire war. Also, on the same day, 10 guided aerial bombs, 3 HIMARS rockets and 4 Flamingo missiles were intercepted. This is official information from the Russian Ministry of Defense. In addition, today Ukrainian drones completely destroyed the railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal near the village of Razdolnoye. This was reported by the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces. The SOF stated that, quote, this was a strategic military logistics artery for the occupiers. The facility was used to supply Russian troops on the southern front, as well as to support the military infrastructure in Crimea. But it was amusing today to watch how Vladimir Putin, was just being tossed from side to side. And at some point, listening to his speeches, I started to doubt, is he even sane? Is he even a human being? What kind of creature is in front of us? The thing is, at first, while talking about these successes at the front and repeating several times the phrase, the guys are pounding Ukraine every day, at that moment Vladimir Putin stated that there are no grounds for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And he says, we don't need any negotiations. We will achieve the goals of the special military operation by military means. A few more 100,000 Russian Ivans will die on the sacred Ukrainian land, and we will continue. And then he complained that the letter from the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, which the Ukrainian leader wrote to the Russian dictator on June 4, quote, does not create the conditions for dialogue, but rather offended him and only adds fuel to the fire of enmity. Well, Volodymyr Putin got offended. But a couple of hours later, it would seem, this same Vladimir Putin declares that Russia is ready for dialogue with Ukraine at any moment based on the Istanbul agreements. But then it just turns into a mess. I don't know, either he couldn't gather his thoughts or he didn't quite understand what he needed to say. And then they read out Putin's quote. We'll analyze it later.
Russia, nevertheless, as has been said more than once, is ready for peace talks with Ukraine, ready for talks based on the agreements reached back in Istanbul. And let me remind you, they were accepted by the Ukrainian delegation at that time. That means they were satisfied with everything. I see no reason for us to move away from these agreements on our part. But based on the agreements reached in Istanbul, on the modalities discussed in Anchorage, and most importantly, on the realities on the ground, as well as the principles I outlined a couple of years ago during my speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Well, if you didn't get it, Vladimir Putin basically named 4 different negotiation formats and supposedly is ready for all of them, and then, almost in the same breath, added, "But we keep on fighting." But here something is changing. Obviously, something is changing in the so-called Russian political establishment. Because the director of the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, Alexander Bortnikov, suddenly admitted today and publicly stated that Vladimir Putin will have to talk specifically with Volodymyr Zelensky and not with someone else. And all these talks about the illegitimacy of the Ukrainian president are just nonsense for poor Russians. Well, for the common rabble, so the rabble have something to talk about in the kitchen in the evening. Next, I'll quote Bortnikov. Zelensky is of course a terrorist, but there is no one else there to talk to at this stage. He is the one making the relevant decisions. Well, as you understand, all these stories about Zelensky's illegitimacy are left only for unwashed Russians to discuss, but on what basis does Vladimir Putin want to negotiate? Let's pause here, as this is an interesting point. And the first thing he mentioned today was the Istanbul agreements. These are the agreements that were supposedly almost signed back in March 2022. They provided for a permanent neutral status for Ukraine, refusal to join NATO, total restrictions for the armed forces of Ukraine, a ban on the deployment of foreign military bases, and separate negotiations regarding Crimea. In addition, Moscow insisted on a significant reduction as part of those agreements of the Ukrainian army and on limiting the West's right to provide military assistance to Kyiv. They're essentially saying you won't have an army, missiles or tanks, and must also agree not to accept military aid from the West. But unlike in the spring of 2022, Ukraine is now simply destroying factories, military factories and oil refineries on Russian territory. And since Ukraine is already directly attacking Moscow, since there are already fires in Moscow, since Crimea will soon be cut off from Russia, as you understand, that format of negotiations is no longer relevant. Well, it's obvious. But for some reason, Vladimir Putin has imagined that Ukrainians will suddenly forget all these successes, all these achievements of recent years and say, well, okay, Putin has deigned to talk, let's negotiate based on the Istanbul agreements. That's complete nonsense. And here the balding dictator Putin should really wake up, and today the permanent representative of Ukraine to the UN, Andriy Melnik, made an important statement at the UN Security Council meeting. He says, guys, Ukraine may reconsider its proposal for a ceasefire with the Russians along the current front line. Next, I'll quote him. Ukraine is ready for direct negotiations with Russia to ensure a just and lasting peace in accordance with the UN Charter, but our patience is not unlimited. If the Security Council continues to take a wait-and-see approach, I do not rule out that Ukraine may reconsider and change its proposal. A ceasefire along the current front line is already a major compromise. And now Melnik pointed out that Ukraine has changed the dynamics of the war, which has been going on for the 5th year thanks to recent strikes against the Russian Empire. According to him, about 40 Russian oil refineries have been hit and damaged. Well, it is reported that oil refining in Russia has already dropped by 25, and it has reached the point where Russia is starting to import gasoline and diesel fuel from other countries. So, the country that used to be called a gas station is now going around the world begging, please give us at least a little gasoline. And that's with Belarus and Kazakhstan are already exporting their gasoline to the unwashed Russians. Okay, so what else does Vladimir Putin propose as the basis for negotiations? And today it proposed to negotiate, well, here's the second point based on that very spirit of Anchorage, but that misses the mark too. Today, Sergei Lavrov, head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said Russia no longer views the United States as an objective mediator in talks with Ukraine. And Russia believes that the Donald Trump administration is moving away from the agreements reached in Anchorage, which no one has actually seen. Next is a quote from Lavrov. As for the United States, As far as we can assess their actions, they seem to be moving away from claiming the role of an objective mediator. And they are following the same course of increasing sanctions pressure on Russia. Donald's statement has also been completely forgotten. Donald Trump's statement, made right after his meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, that what is needed in Ukraine is a long-term peace, not a ceasefire for a couple of years, has been completely forgotten. And then Lavrov started manipulating things there, saying, look, at the UN Security Council, they're discussing a ceasefire, not ending the war. In the end, Sergei Lavrov shared his suspicions that the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Anchorage last August. Last year was a deception aimed at buying time to supply additional weapons to Kyiv. Therefore, Lavrov admits that bald dwarf Vladimir Putin was once again deceived and tricked like a complete fool. Next is a quote from Lavrov. I don't even want to suspect that Alaska, like the actions of Europe, was intended to buy time to rearm the Kyiv regime. I don't even want to think about it. But in reality, it turned out the way it did. In addition to the extension of all Biden's sanctions, a significant package of sanctions from the Trump administration against Russia has already been adopted. That's how it is. Well, today I wrote a short post about this topic on my Telegram channel. I'm amazed by the stupidity of Russians who still watch my episodes. I guess I'd like to address you, or maybe there's no point in addressing you. Anyway, here's the point. Just imagine you are shareholders, a shareholder of a company that suddenly became unprofitable. You see the shares of this company just plummeting. You come to the board of directors or you come to the CEO of this company and ask, what's going on? Why is the stock price falling? And this CEO or the board of directors tells you we were tricked, we were deceived, we were cheated. Vladimir Putin has been telling Russians for several years how he was cheated, how he was tricked, how he was deceived, the West deceived him and so on. Now imagine that you are a shareholder and the CEO of the company says, I was tricked again. For the 15th time I was tricked and cheated. Well, I think that as a reasonable shareholder you would probably demand that the board of directors remove the CEO, get rid of him and appoint someone else. But if the whole world can deceive him so easily, it means he's a bad manager. It means he can't run a big company where you've invested your money. He just can't. You can't blame everyone else for deceiving him so blatantly. No, everyone acts in their own interests. Most likely you would fire a manager who is being deceived so blatantly by everyone. But Russians think differently, works differently. They became even more angry at the West, like how could this happen? That damned West is constantly deceiving, tricking, and screwing over our fool, that guy from St. Petersburg, Volodya Putin. Yeah, our president is a complete fool. Everyone tricks him, everyone deceives him, but everyone is to blame, except who? Except their leader. I will never understand this logic. But sorry for that little digression. And then, like a bolt from the blue, comes a statement from Kyiv Independent about the details of the talks between Trump and Zelensky at the G7 summit. President Donald Trump privately advised his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky to act much more boldly toward Russia. A high-ranking Ukrainian official told this to Kyiv Independent, and here is what he said. Trump says that he actually doesn't believe Putin will do anything without pressure. According to American officials, the US president considers strength to be a key factor in war and negotiations. And since Vladimir Putin didn't agree to any deal, Trump decided that it was time, as they say, to hit Vladimir Putin's brazen, bald face so hard by proxy that he would finally sober up. And he started thinking about negotiations. Here, it can be assumed that the intensification of Ukrainian strikes on the Russian Federation, including massive attacks on Moscow and cutting off logistics in the occupied territories, helped convince Trump that Kyiv is in a stronger position than at the beginning of the year. And let me remind you, sources at Bloomberg were talking about this about a week ago as well. According to them, now the US president and those around him believe that Moscow will not be able to achieve victory on the battlefield, and Kyiv's position is getting stronger. And it's important to understand that after pulling out of the war against Iran, where the US never achieved any major convincing victory, Donald Trump needs to show the electorate, in other words the voters, some other success story. And since his public threats no longer work on Iran, he can easily switch back to the topic of Russia's war against Ukraine. But putting pressure on Kiev won't work anymore, simply because, to put it bluntly, Trump has nothing to pressure Kiev with. Why is that? Let's be honest. At this point, absolutely all support for Ukraine has fallen on the shoulders of the European Union. The US is not investing in this support at all, except for selling weapons. So what leverage does Donald Trump have here? Well, in fact, none. And as we've seen, Zelensky can turn to the Europeans. And the Europeans will already be developing some common positions with him. But a victory before the elections in November is needed. And that's why it's easy to assume that Trump is really giving Ukraine carte blanche for these massive strikes against feral Russia. So that if Kiev succeeds, he can cling to this victory and declare that it was actually his doing, that he was the one who advised them to act this way. But Vladimir Putin is now doing everything he can to encourage Russians who for some reason have started to complain. For example, they're complaining about the gasoline shortage, about some explosions in Moscow, saying something exploded in Voronezh, the power was cut off in Crimea, and gas stations really aren't selling gasoline. But pay attention once again to his statement about negotiations, because everything there is all mixed up. The Istanbul agreements and some modalities from Anchorage and the realities on the ground, and honestly, who knows what else.
But based on the agreements reached in Istanbul, on the modalities that were discussed in Anchorage, and most importantly, the realities on the ground, as well as the principles I outlined a couple of years ago during my speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
And finally, I'll tell you how Russians were once again made to look like fools. Do you remember how in April and May, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation and even the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, Sergei Shoigu, followed by all Russian propaganda, were telling stories that supposedly Ukrainian defenders were launching drones at targets in Russia from the territory of the Baltic states, and that these countries had allegedly opened their airspace for drones to fly towards St. Petersburg? Do you remember? At that time, Russian ports on the Baltic Sea were still burning. Back then, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service and Ministry of Foreign Affairs even declared readiness to use nuclear weapons. And the frenzied Russians howled in ecstasy, saying, "We'll punish the Baltic countries too, how dare they?" And they were foaming at the mouth, insisting that Ukraine was supposedly already using the airspace and even naming military bases from which Ukraine could launch drones at Russia from the territory of the Baltic countries. So today, Vladimir Putin stated that there have never been any drone launches from the territory of the Baltic countries. And in general, they are supposedly so afraid of Russia there that they don't even think about anything like that.
Well, they still haven't gone so far as to launch anything from their own territory yet. They understand that there will be a retaliatory strike because everyone understands this, or at least should understand it. That's why they try in every possible way to distance themselves from this, like when, say, in countries such as the Baltic states, some drones show up there or Ukrainian drones somehow fly there. But still, they don't point fingers at Moscow, they say these are Ukrainian drones. Well, a mistake there, a system failure, something went wrong, something else. But so far they haven't gotten to the point of launching directly from their own territory.
I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and join my private community, Pechiy Insight. It's a platform where we discuss various topics together. I personally answer your questions, and that's also where we discuss topics for future YouTube episodes. This platform is on Patreon, so follow the link in the description of this video, subscribe, and join our community. If you just want to support the work of this channel, you can do so with any donation, also through the links and details in the description of this video. And also subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News, the link to it is also in the description. That's all for now, take care of yourselves, goodbye everyone.